Good evening. My name is Gerda Sanders. On behalf of the Women's Week Committee, I welcome you to our final event of this Women's Week, a keynote address by Dr. Susan Douglas on this year's theme, Motherhood Matters, Challenges, Complications, and New Definitions. Dr. Douglas is the author of The Mommy Myth, The Idealization of Motherhood and How It Undermines Women, and she'll be speaking on the topic of her book. But in a minute, Bryn Bond will introduce her with much more fanfare. In the meantime, I just want to let you know that the one ongoing Women's Week event is still the art exhibition at the Bailey Exhibition Hall at the College of Architecture, which if you haven't seen it, I really urge you to take a detour in that direction and see it. Our exhibit this year is the work of the artist Alice Perot. Perot's paintings depict her experiences as the mother of Julius, who suffered a lack of oxygen during birth that resulted in major injuries to his brain, and the mother of Cyrus, who died at birth. Our committee chose Perot's painting Ride as our poster art for Women's Week. It is a portrait of Perot giving Julius a ride on her back. Perot wrote about the piece, "You can't carry him around forever. That's what people tell me. But all I have is forever. Anything less is paralyzing. Forever to love him, forever to lift him, forever to believe that he embodies the shift that will tilt this world's cruel imbalances. This is our ride." Then I would just like to let you know that we are also raising money during all our Women's Week's events and also tonight for the Crisis Nursery. Please visit the table at the back of the room for information on the Family Support Center's Crisis Nursery, which offers free respite childcare 24 hours a day. And please make a donation if you can. Then I also want to point out to you the obvious, that King's English is at the back of the room and will be selling Dr. Douglas's books as well as other related books that you might be interested in. So do take some time to browse afterward. I now would like to introduce Bryn Bond, who is a philosophy major, a student at university, and she's also a gender studies minor. So we ask Bryn to introduce Dr. Douglas.
Hi. As Gerda said, my name is Bryn Bond. I'm a student here at the University of Utah and a member of the Women's Week Planning Committee. Thank you for joining us here tonight at this final event of what has been a truly successful Women's Week. The theme for this year's Women's Week celebration has been Motherhood Matters, Challenges, Complications, and New Definitions. This week's events have explored the roles, experiences, and institution of motherhood through the art of Alice Perot, the personal narratives performed in the Mommy Monologues, the experiences of working women, including those of both mothers and those who have chosen not to become mothers, in the panel discussion On the Clock, and the insightful and eloquent words of yesterday's keynote presentation by Julianne Melvo. To round out this remarkable lineup, I am pleased to introduce to you tonight's keynote speaker, Susan Douglas. Dr. Douglas is a professor of communication studies at the University of Michigan and chair of the department. Dr. Douglas is also the author of a number of books and articles that explore the portrayal of women and girls in the media, including Where the Girls Are, Growing Up Female with the Mass Media, and The Mommy Myth, The Idealization of Motherhood and How It Has Undermined Women. In addition to her regular column titled Back Talk, which appears in These Times, she has also been featured on The Today Show, The Oprah Winfrey Show, NPR's Fresh Air, and Talk of the Nation, just to name a few. It is truly an honor to have her here with us tonight to discuss the important and often trivialized issue of motherhood. As a committee, we chose this theme for a number of reasons, among them to explore the ways in which motherhood is both glorified and devalued in society. On the one hand is the image of the perfect mother, as American as apple pie, June Cleaver, or Donna Reed, and the more modern idealization ranging from selfless soccer moms to blissful and effortless-looking celebrity mothers. On the other hand are the relentless depictions of motherhood gone awry, welfare mothers, crack mothers, and those mothers seemingly dedicated to their own ambitions at the cost of their children's well-being. To add to this narrow portrayal is the ever-sensationalized war between working mothers and stay-at-home moms, subtly urging all mothers to choose a side. Lost in this dichotomous picture are the more genuine, albeit less glamorous or sensational, experiences and challenges of mothers from a diversity of cultural, social, and economic backgrounds. It has been our hope as a committee to explore these fictions and simplifications of motherhood by presenting instead the complexities and challenges that mothers from all backgrounds face, rather than further dissecting the differences between these women. With that said, to continue this exploration, please welcome Dr. Susan Douglas.
Good evening. Can you all hear me? Yes? Good. I'm going to have to adjust this slightly here. Still hear me, yeah? First of all, I can't tell you how delighted I am to be here. I have never been in Salt Lake City before, and it is so gorgeous. And I know the weather is like this all the time. So thank you for that. But it's been an absolute delight to come to this gorgeous city on such a lovely day, and to have already met, I have to say, an array of just extraordinary people and extraordinary women. And I want to thank Leo Leckie and Bryn Bond especially for bringing me out here. This is just a great treat for me. I have a teenage daughter. So you know what that means. I'm totally embarrassing. I do not know anything. My clothes are appalling. My makeup is appalling. Old lady makeup, I believe, is the phrase used. I never listen. I'm too loud. I breathe too loudly. I chew too loudly. And I am also the meanest person in the solar system. So why you invited me here is unclear. But tonight I want to talk about the myth of the perfect mother and what we've labeled the new momism, which is a highly romanticized and utterly demanding myth of the perfect mother in which the standards for success are impossible to achieve. Now, while this is a white upper middle class and middle class rule book, it nonetheless polices us all, regardless of race, class, or sexual orientation, because it is spritzed out through so many media outlets. These days, no matter how much you do, it is never, ever enough. And it's never good enough. This idealization of motherhood is dangerous and it's reactionary. It corrodes women's self-esteem and it pits mothers against each other. It undermines women's rights and opportunities because it insists that the issues around motherhood and the welfare of our children is somehow an individual problem. So we're supposed to focus on ourselves, our own performances as mothers, rather than focus on how our politicians, our government, and many, many workplaces have failed to support mothers and their children. In this country, motherhood and mothers are revered in rhetoric and reviled in public policy. Tonight I want to lay out how we got here, what the building blocks of the new momism have been, and why we should resist this and what we can do. There is a difference between being a good mother and trying to be a perfect mother. The talk is also not about the merits of having or not having children. Both choices have their pluses and their minuses, their joys and their regrets. Rather, the talk is about how the pressures on mothers are actually, I'm going to argue, worse than they were in the 1950s. This is about what we are supposed to expect of ourselves and of our kids if we make the choice to have children. And there are young women in the audience, and my goal is to try to inoculate you against the new momism, because it will trap you and stress you out further. So what's an ideal mother today? An ideal mother pipes Mozart into her womb while she's pregnant. She gives up her job to be a stay-at-home mom, no matter what the cost, because the only righteous, high road option is to be a stay-at-home mom. And note, I'm saying mom, not mother. We'll come back to that in a minute. The ideal mother designs themed nurseries and commissions hand-painted wall murals that express her child's personality. She usually does this before the child is born, so how she knows what the personality is another matter. The good mother always sends homemade baked goods, never store-bought, into school events, preferably cakes baked in the shape of Hogwarts. She hand makes all of her child's Halloween costumes all the time. She uses flashcards to boost her baby's brain power, beginning at the age of 2 months. Now she co-sleeps with her children until they're 14. And she succeeds in being her teenage child's best friend. Now, before I get into this, you're really entitled to know my credentials for giving such a talk, so allow me to introduce myself. I am one of those people that the Wall Street Journal, CBS News, and a variety of other media outlets loves to make fun of because I'm a professor of media studies. Now, you know what that means. I probably teach entire courses on the films of Elvis Presley. I go to academic conferences where the main intellectual exchange is trading comic books. I never make my students read books. And I insist that Ace of Base, Usher, Britney Spears are much more important than William Faulkner, Hegel, or Eleanor Roosevelt. All I do now, of course, is study Buffy, and to a lesser extent, the OC. Now, the reason I chose the media over, say, the Renaissance or quantum mechanics is because I don't like to read, I don't know much about history, and I needed desperately to find a way to watch television for a living. This, anyway, is the caricature of people like me. See, if enough people think that studying the media is a trivial waste of time, then the media themselves can seem less influential than they really are. Then they get off the hook for doing what they do best, promoting a white, upper-middle-class male view of the world that urges the rest of us to sit passively on our sofas and fantasize about consumer goods while they handle the important stuff, like the economy, the environment, child care, war. Now, if it was important enough for them to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to bring us Mr. Ed, does everybody know about Mr. Ed, the show with the talking horse? Okay. Or my favorite perfume commercial from the 1970s for Angeli. Some of you probably haven't seen it, so I'll act it out. A woman comes on screen shimmying, "I can bring home the bacon, fry it up in the pan, and never ever let you forget you're a man." Great ad. This was meant to be a liberated ad. And now, of course, millions of dollars are being spent on all kinds of shows, from Survivor to My Super Sweet 16. If they're spending all this money on all of this range of stuff, it's important for us to figure out why. Now, my other qualification for talking about the representations of motherhood in the media is actually much worse than the first one, because I'm a feminist. Blech. Now, I'm not supposed to admit I'm a feminist, and neither are you. The moment the women's movement emerged in the 1970s, feminism again became a dirty word with considerable help from the mainstream media. And for my book, Where the Girls Are, I looked at all of the network coverage of the women's movement, read all of the coverage in Time and Newsweek and the New York Times and so forth, and I can assure you that the coverage was condescending and dismissive. News reports and opinion columnists created a new stereotype, and these are just some of the terms: fanatics, braless bubbleheads, Amazons, the angries, and my personal favorite, a band of wild lesbians, as opposed presumably to tame ones. The result is that today we all know what feminists are. Feminists are shrill, overly aggressive, man-hating, selfish, hairy, extremist, deliberately unattractive women with absolutely no sense of humor who see sexism at every turn. Feminists detest the family and think all children should be deported or drowned. Feminists are relentless, unforgiving, and unwilling to bend or compromise. Feminists are single-handedly responsible for the high divorce rate, the shortage of decent men, and the deeply unfortunate proliferation of Birkenstocks in America. Now, given all of this baggage, it's really best to say I'm not a feminist, but before putting forward a feminist position. In 1989, Time announced hairy legs haunt the feminist movement and concluded that the women's movement was hopelessly dated. We saw what happened to Hillary Clinton in the 1992 campaign, a full 10 years after she changed her name to Bills so people wouldn't think she was too independent or anything. She was forced to prove that she could operate a hand mixer and smile adoringly and silently at her husband, something we now know must have taken a great deal of fortitude. This is what happens to you in America if you dare to identify yourself with the F word. Social analyst, faux historian, and radio commentator Rush Limbaugh notes, quote, "Feminism was established to allow unattractive women easier access to the mainstream of society," end quote. Fortunately, no social movement was needed to allow pudgy, unattractive men access to the top. Feminists, of course, have wrecked everything. Let's not forget Pat Robertson, who said that feminism, and I quote, "encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, and practice witchcraft." And Pat Robinson, you may recall, blamed the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and on the Pentagon on gays, lesbians, pagans, and last but not least, feminists. Given all this, it is hardly surprising when many women, and especially young women, say, "I'm not a feminist, but," and then put forward a feminist position. The media have repeatedly declared us to be in a post-feminist era, and when announcing yet again the death of feminism, they focus on the first part of the statement, "I'm not a feminist." They downplay the "but" and ignore the comma between the two. But the comma is crucial. The comma is the fulcrum of the whole statement. That marks the divisions, but more importantly, the connections between the disavowal of feminism in the first part of the phrase and its embrace at the end. The comma says that the speaker is ambivalent, that she's torn between a philosophy she knows seeks to improve her lot in life, and a desire not to take on a stereotype that has nothing to do with who she is and will simply marginalize her. Most importantly, the comma identifies the speaker as someone who both acquiesces to and resists media representations of women and of feminism. So I hope that all of us who aren't afraid to call ourselves feminists will be understanding of our sisters who are reluctant to take on that label, because in fact, when a woman says, "I'm not a feminist, but," she's really admitting that she is. So, what might a feminist and media studies person like myself, who also happens to be a mother, have to say about the changing representations of motherhood in the media over the past 30 years? Now, first I want to warn the young women in the audience who may not yet be mothers, but someday might become mothers, that if you think that the media representations surrounding you now, the ones that drip hydrochloric acid on your self-esteem by insisting you're too fat, your thighs have too much cellulite, a term invented by the cosmetic industry, that your face has made the mistake of having pores on it, that you need to start using oil of Olay now so you don't look like Andy Rooney by the time you're 30, just wait until you become a mother. Mothers, and especially working mothers, are bombarded on a daily basis with guilt-inducing messages that no matter what you're doing, someone or something, your job, your kids, your friendships, your relationship, is being let down. Working mothers since the 1980s have been caught, in fact, between two very powerful trends. One is the speed up at work and the decline of leisure time, which so many of us are experiencing now and was documented very well in Juliet Shore's terrific book, The Overworked American, which began to document the decline of leisure time in the 1980s. So we have a speed up at work, decline of leisure time, and the escalating standards for perfection around motherhood. So, now why did I write this book? Well, I had a child in 1988, and I got the kind that doesn't sleep. This one was up at 4:30 for the day. She also did not nap. And so when you're like waiting for the Today Show to come on, things are really desperate. And I'm noting that maybe some people in the audience have had this similar experience. Also, unlike Sarah Jessica Parker, I did not weigh less after having my baby than I did before. So at 7:30 or 8, I would put on my husband's sweatpants, which at the time were the only thing that fit, some, sweatshirt or sweater with those baby, milk spit up splotches on the shoulder, hair that hadn't seen a comb in a couple of days, and dragged my sorry ass and my baby to the supermarket to buy all of the stuff we needed. So we get through the supermarket, I've got a screaming baby in the cart, we get to the checkout line, and there they were, the bleachers of magazines. And on the cover, Pamela Lee says, "Motherhood is sexy." I felt about as sexy as Rush Limbaugh in a thong. Kathy Lee, Joan London, there they were, all of these beautiful, perfect celebrity mothers. And and they were always photographed backlit in kind of a white light, so they had this kind of halo around them. The kids were dressed in white. The children were perfectly made up, and of course they were perfectly made up. They were almost exclusively white actresses. You went inside the magazine, and they would tell you all of the things that they were doing with their kids, from spontaneous play dates and somersaults in the park to teaching them Latin at the age of 2, that they were doing to ensure that their kids would be Nobel laureates by the time they were 12. But what was really pernicious about the celebrity mom profiles is that they told you how you were supposed to feel. And you were supposed to feel elated, blissed out, 24/7 because of motherhood. Now, we all loved our children desperately, but we were not blissed out and elated 24/7 at the prospect of motherhood. There were joys and there were deep frustrations and exhaustion. So it seemed to me that there was a huge gap between the life I was living, and I was a very privileged woman. I had health insurance. I had access to babysitters. I had a partner. And I had something else even better. I had a high-quality, affordable daycare center down the road. And yet I found the gap between my life and these celebrity mom profiles and the other kinds of messages and representations of motherhood in the media preposterous. And so this seemed to me that we had come to a sorry pass and needed to be addressed. So what did I learn from looking at the images of motherhood in the mass media? Well, we saw the rise of something called intensive mothering. Intensive mothering is a term coined by Sharon Hayes, who's a sociologist and a quite terrific one at UVA, and who's written a terrific book called The Cultural Contradictions of Motherhood. It's more of an academic book than mine is. It's a very smart, good book. Intensive mothering insists that mothers acquire professional-level skills, such as those of therapist, pediatrician, Dr. Mom, consumer product safety inspector, and teacher, and that they lavish every ounce of physical vitality they have, the monetary equivalent of the gross domestic product of Australia, and most of all, every single bit of their emotional, mental, and psychic energy on their kids. We must learn to put on the masquerade of the doting, self-sacrificing mother and wear it at all times. Intensive mothering is the ultimate female Olympics. We are all in powerful competition with each other, in constant danger of being trumped by the mom down the street or in the magazine we're reading. The competition is not over who's a good mother, it's over who's the best. We compete with each other, we compete with ourselves. The best mothers always put their kids' needs before their own, period. The best mothers are the main caregivers. For the best mothers, their kids are the center of the universe. The best mothers always smile. They always understand. They are never tired. They never lose their temper. They never say, "Go to the neighbor's house and play while mommy has a beer." Their love for their children is boundless, unflagging, flawless, total. Mothers today cannot just respond to their kids' needs, they must predict them, and with the telepathic accuracy of Houdini. They must memorize verbatim the books of all of the child care experts and know which approaches are developmentally appropriate at which ages. They are supposed to treat their 2-year-olds with respect. If mothers screw up and fail to do this on any given day, they should apologize to their kids, because any misstep leads, yes, to permanent psychological and or physical damage. Anyone who questions whether this is the best and the necessary way to raise kids is an insensitive, ignorant brute. This has just become our common sense. Now, each of us, of course, has her own individual story as a mother, those of us who are mothers, her own demons and satisfactions, her own failures and goals. But motherhood is in our culture emphasized as such an individualized achievement, something you and you alone excel at or screw up. So it's easy to forget that motherhood is a collective experience. We need to erase the amnesia about motherhood. We do have a common history. It does tie us together, and it has made us simultaneously guilt-ridden and ready for an uprising. So this book is a 30-year tour through the mass media to see how the representations of motherhood have changed. The book looks at the news, toy ads, sitcoms, women's magazines, news accounts, so on and so forth. And we really wanted to start in the early 1970s with the rise of the women's movement, because it was then that the women's movement really challenged the way in which motherhood was institutionalized in this country. So there is an awful myth that feminists always and still hated mothers, hated stay-at-home moms, hated kids. This is a lie. If you look at the early issues of Ms. Magazine, for example, from the beginning, those magazines focused on motherhood. How to help mothers find work if they needed to, how to network with other women around children's issues, how to fight for daycare centers. But what feminists did do is challenge motherhood as an institution that insisted that women had to be totally economically and emotionally dependent upon their husbands. That's what the women's movement challenged. And as a result of that, the attitudes about motherhood began to change dramatically in this country. Other factors were at work as well. In the 1970s, particularly in the mid and late 1970s, the economy went very sour in this country. We had something called stagflation. There was very high unemployment and double-digit inflation. And mothers knew how to whip inflation. They went to work. There was an escalating divorce rate in this country in the 1970s, and 90% of single households were headed by mothers. So you had an increased divorce rate, a souring economy, and a women's movement that gave women permission to go back to work. The women who went into the workforce between 1975 and 1985, who were mothers of small children, are members of an absolutely pioneering generation of women who had very few role models and hardly any support to do what they did. So this was a very revolutionary time for women, and as a result, you began to see a whole host of responses in the media to deal with this new reality. The women's magazines would organize these panel discussions among different mothers to bring mothers together to share advice. What happens when I get divorced? How do I find housing? How do I find a job? What do I do with my little kids? There was a lot of advice about housework. What housework? Forget the housework. There's only so much you can do. Let the housework go. Have your children, yes, this was before the Martha Stewartization of America. How to help your kids have your kids help with chores, and so on and so forth. It was a time of great flux. Advertisers discovered the new working mother and began to seek to appeal to her in a variety of very empowering ways. Beginning in the mid-1980s, however, we begin to see a backlash. And what I want to really lay out now are what some of the building blocks were of the new momism and how they got into place. And I want to talk about 4 of them: fear, fantasy, marketing, and politics. So let's talk about fear first. We began to get, in the mid-1980s, the news peg of the endangered child. Television news in particular discovered the endangered child. Now, there was an institutional reason that helps explain this. In the mid to late 1980s, the news divisions of the networks, which had previously been funded by, basically bankrolled by the entertainment divisions of the networks, were spun off, and they had to basically foot their own bill and go in the black and not the red. They could no longer rely on the entertainment divisions to carry them. This meant that ratings mattered a lot more. At the same time, there was a rise in tabloid journalism. You may remember the premiere of Current Affair and some of these tabloid TV shows that came out that also put more competitive pressure on the networks to develop more sensational style and story. So getting higher ratings mattered, getting more female viewers mattered, and so sensationalism mattered as well. Now, we began, and I don't want to suggest that all the news divisions got together and said, oh my God, we need viewers, let's focus on endangered children. It doesn't work that way. The news also does tap into prevailing anxieties and concerns in a culture, and there was a revolution in family life going on at this time that the news media tapped into. But the way in which they tapped into it scared mothers to death. So we had missing children everywhere. Now, there was a very famous story that many of you may know about that was made into a made-for-TV movie about Adam, this little boy who did go missing by a stranger he did not know in Florida, and became a national story. And that became a news peg for other stories about missing children. But what happened is you began to get wildly over-reported accounts of how many children were going missing in the United States. Because one of the things that happened is that children who were allegedly missing as part of custody disputes between divorced or separated couples, that got folded into figures in which children had been abducted by a stranger. So the figures were wildly exaggerated and made it seem like there was an epidemic of abducted and missing children in the United States. And it made mothers think that they had to be as vigilant as a Secret Service agent guarding the President of the United States when thinking about their kid. We also had, beginning in 1984 and 1985, a raft of stories about daycare centers allegedly staffed by Satanists and child molesters. The first story that broke on this, as some of you will remember, is the McMartin Daycare Center, which was one of the premier daycare centers in a suburb of LA. It was reputed to be a quite good daycare center. Allegations were made by, it later turned out, a mentally disturbed woman who had a history of being incapable of distinguishing reality from her own delusions. She made these charges. KABC in LA learned of the charges, and they sat on them until Sweeps Week in February. You all know what Sweeps Week is? Yeah, okay. So they could get the highest ratings possible. So this story has a sordid beginning from the very start. Without going into details about the McMartin case, it was one of the most expensive trials in American history. No one was ever convicted. The teachers never testified against each other. There was never any evidence that anything like what this woman had alleged happened. And in fact, what did come out during the trial, and all the charges were eventually dropped or the defendants were acquitted, is that the kids had been taken off by a psychologist and coached to give the answers that the prosecutor wanted to hear. And they were coached with lines like, little Johnny told us what happened. Little Johnny told us about the tunnels under the daycare center. Don't you want to be smart like little Johnny and tell us what happened? So it was a real scandal. But once the McMartin case broke, and it was really interesting for me to watch the news as part of the research for this book, because you'd think if you're looking at motherhood, sure, women's magazines, sitcoms, etc., you wouldn't necessarily think about the news. And it's amazing the role that the news media has played in scaring mothers and also playing a role in elevating these standards of perfection. So after the McMartin case broke, week after week after week, there were stories about daycare centers allegedly staffed by pedophiles and Satanists. And nearly all of these cases, eventually the defendants were acquitted. The charges were proved to be false. But if you are a mother sitting at home watching the news with your little kids and thinking about, what am I going to do with my kids while I work because I have to work? You become terrified about daycare, and you become terrified about letting your kids out of your sight. And that's a building block of the new momism. Fear. Fear that we always have to be with our children and can't let them out of our sights. So that's building block number one. Building block number two was fantasy, and this gets us back to the celebrity moms that I mentioned earlier on. I looked at the covers of 4 leading women's magazines, Good Housekeeping, Ladies' Home Journal, McCall's, and Red Book, from 1975 to 2000. And just to see, when did we start getting these celebrity moms with their miracle babies? And they were always miracle babies on the cover. And in the 1970s, from 75 to 81, there was one of all those years, and it was a cover story about Princess Grace. 81 was the turning point, and by the late 1980s, between 1/5 and 1/4 of the magazine covers of these magazines featured celebrity moms and their miracle babies. And as the stories progressed, they were often about why it's more important for me now to give up my career, to stay home with my baby, and so on and so forth. Again, you would go inside and you got very normative standards of perfection about how to be a perfect mom, like the celebrity on the cover, and how you should feel about it. And there was, of course, an enormous amount of conspicuous consumption, all of the stuff they bought for their kids to make their children really happy, the bed in the shape of a lobster boat, the hand-painted murals on the wall, and so on and so forth. Now, who does not want to fantasize that having small children is blissful and stress-free? Who doesn't want to read a story in which we see Jane Seymour relaxing with her twins? 2 words that I never knew went together, relax and twins. And she is, of course, relaxing with her twins on Barbados, which is nice if you have a SWAT team of nannies and the sunny disposition that goes with it. Who doesn't want to enter that fantasy where your husband is always thrilled to see you, he's participating 50-50, loves you and buys you a diamond bracelet because you're such a great mom? Well, that's a nice fantasy, and it's an escapist one, but it, had these highly normative elements to it. Now, I don't want to suggest that the women's magazines were being completely cynical here, because if you think about this generation I just described of women who went back to work between 75 and 85, even if their mothers worked, their mothers didn't go back to work until the kids were in kindergarten or first grade. These mothers were going back to work when their kids were 6 months old, or 6 weeks old, or a year old. They didn't have the same kind of role models. And so the service element of these women's magazines was, well, celebrity mothers are doing that. So they are role models. They are working on the set for 12 hours a day, and then they're coming home and taking care of their kids. So some of this was cynical about using celebrities to sell magazines, and some of it had an element of service. But what it did, as the celebrity mom profile ossified over the years, and it did into a very strict form in which the celebrity mother could never utter a bat squeak of ambivalence about being a mother or having kids. She could only say it was always joyful and wonderful. And that was a mantle that we were supposed to put on as well. Now, marketing. Now, when I was a kid, there was silly putty, there were hula hoops, there were cap guns for boys and dolls for girls and a few other things. End of story. In the 1980s, the toy industry went through a revolution. They began to become much, much more sophisticated in their marketing and their research in developing toys for children. And one of the things that they began to do was divide kids up into ever narrower demographic niches. And each niche came and comes with a bleacher load of products that the savvy mother is supposed to buy. So if you go into toy stores now, it's 0 to 3 months, 3 months to 6 months, 6 months to 9 months, right, so on and so forth. And you better buy the right toy for the right age group or else. And so we have, and this has really spun out of hand in the early 21st century. Now, I was a sucker for a lot of this stuff because I'm the demo that these educational toy people want. You know, I'm their target market. They want me to buy those, you know, I don't know how many of you know those black and white mobiles, right, that you're supposed to put in the crib and like turned your kid into Einstein, you know. I had one of those. So, you know, do we want our kids to, you know, be developmentally enriched and all the rest? Sure. But what began to happen was a proliferation of these market segments, television shows based on toys, serials based on toys, all kinds of interlocking ways in which food products, clothing, toys, cartoons were all sold to our kids and to us simultaneously. So we were getting more bombarded than ever because our kids were getting more bombarded than ever. It wasn't just Sesame Street anymore. There was Nickelodeon. And Nickelodeon deserves a lot of props for doing a great deal of counter-stereotypical programming, but it was still supported by advertising. And kids were regarded, and I quote, as guided missiles of marketing. They would come at you, and then the marketers would come at you as well. So things really began to get out of hand by the early 21st century. Now, you go to parenting magazines, which of course are really magazines for mothers, not parents, and there are flashcards that really, they are really selling flashcards that you're supposed to use with your 6-month-old child. They are selling computer games for 9 to 12-month-old children to prepare them to learn geometry and algebra. There are boxes that you can put your child's toys in at the end of the day, and it sterilizes their toys. Now, when my kid was a baby, the doctor said, well, you know, she's got to develop an immune system. Right? No more. So things have, and of course the nursery furniture now. You cannot, I am very sorry, just buy a crib and a diaper pail. Everything has to be coordinated. The crib is the centerpiece furniture. You build around that. And there are designer, there's Gucci baby clothes. I mean, things have really gotten completely out of hand. And then when your kid is a teenager, oh my God, that's a whole other topic. The way that they're divided into, like, you know, 9 to 11 or 10 to 12, 13 to 15, with a whole host of brands that are supposed to go for them as well. So, but the main message of all of this marketing is that you better buy all this stuff for your kid to enrich your child physically, enrich your child psychologically, enrich your child intellectually, because if you don't, the savvy mom down the block is going to buy that stuff. And her kid's going to go to university and be successful, and your kid is going to be working in Dunkin' Donuts. And that's the message that they use. Now, politics. There has been such a powerful backlash against working mothers just at the moment when working mothers and families needed more support from government and politicians than ever before. When the Reagan administration came in, it came in with a premise of cutting down the federal government. That was the underlying premise of Reaganism, that you wanted to shrink the federal government. And this was happening, so this philosophy was emerging just at the time when there was a massive need for affordable, high-quality daycare in the United States. There were also philosophical attacks on daycare, but the government philosophy of shrinking down the government happened just at the time when families needed more support in all kinds of areas: health care for their kids, flex time for families, daycare centers that were affordable. And there has been an ongoing attack, of course, on daycare. We have the most pathetic public policies in the industrialized world for families and children. We do not have paid maternity and paternity leave like other industrialized countries do. We do not have high-quality, affordable, universally available preschool for the kids of this country. In other industrialized countries, this is not seen as some special interest for working mothers. It's seen as a great thing to provide children in the society. We do not have universal health care for our children, and on and on. So what is a mother to do? What have we been urged to do? To individually internalize all of these institutional losses and make up for them ourselves. And so that has been another big stress on mothers. And finally, in politics, and the Democrats and the Republicans share equal blame for this, there began to be a very concerted ideological attack on welfare and welfare mothers. Welfare mothers are poor mothers. That's why they need welfare. But the attack, particularly as it was staged in the news media, highly racialized and sensationalized welfare in this country. So that and I looked at all of the coverage of welfare that came out beginning in 1968. And what you began to see, what you saw in 1968, you heard the words poverty. You heard the words poor people. By the 1980s, you weren't hearing that anymore. And so how did the news media cover welfare? They always focused on a teenage girl who had several children by several different men, none of whom she had married, whose mother was on welfare and whose grandmother was on welfare. I cannot tell you what an infinitesimal portion of the welfare population these families were. Yet they were sensational, and especially when there was a whole panic about teenage pregnancy in this country, those were great families to highlight. 75% of women on welfare had 2 children or less. 75% of them were off of welfare in 3 to 5 years. We never heard about the women who were on welfare because they were battered women and had to leave the home. And so the message, and where did they go? Are there poor women struggling to take care of their families on welfare in Nebraska or rural Maine? You bet there are. But where's the news made? In Washington and New York. So where do they always go? Newark and Camden, New Jersey. So if I now say welfare mother to any group of people, the first image that comes into one's mind is an African American inner city woman with multiple children by multiple different men. And the stereotype that emerged about black mothers, that they are ipso facto neglectful, promiscuous, bad mothers. And this is one of the most pernicious, evil stereotypes to come out about motherhood through the mass media. And it was very important for us in the book to juxtapose how welfare mothers were portrayed with how celebrity mothers were portrayed. So, if we think of June Cleaver as the uber suburban mom of the 1950s, right? Let's think about what June Cleaver was not expected to do. June Cleaver was not expected to pipe Mozart into her womb so that the beaver came out perfectly tuned. June Cleaver was not expected to drill him with flashcards. She was not expected to drive him 10 hours round trip to a soccer match. She was not expected to make sure he learned French before he was 5. She certainly was not expected to homeschool him. These are the kinds of standards that are out there, misted out in the world. So, and it's not just that this imagery might undermine mothers' self-esteem, make them feel guilty. These representations of motherhood and the standards of perfection that we're supposed to achieve and the degree to which we are supposed to be 100% 24/7 focused on our kids has real consequences in the workplace and in public policy. It reinforces the notion that we don't need a national, affordable, high-quality daycare. It reinforces the notion that families, and I'm not just talking about women here, need flex time. It reinforces the notion that we don't need paid paternity and maternity leave. It reinforces the notion that, well, universal child care, health care, whatever, although I think that's going to change. It also reinforces economic discrimination against mothers. If you go to momsrising.org, which is this great new organization, they have a terrific website. There are a bunch of motherhood organizations online. Mothers and More, Moms Rising, which was co-founded by Joan Blades, who was one of the co-founders of Move On, has founded momsrising.org, and what they're trying to do is bring together a whole host of groups that care about children's welfare and issues around mothers and motherhood. And one of the things they're foregrounding is the motherhood wage penalty. For those of you who've read Ann Crittenden's terrific book, The Price of Motherhood, Ann Crittenden also has a fabulous web page as well. Ann Crittenden documented the price that mothers pay, that fathers do not pay, economically when they have children. So just listen to some of these different studies. One study showed that mothers were 44% less likely to be hired than equally qualified non-mothers. Another study found that women without kids, we have this percentage of women still making less to the dollar than men make, that women without kids make 90 cents to a man's dollar, but mothers make 73 cents to a man's dollar. Single mothers make 60 cents to a man's dollar. And of course, some of this has to do with class and racial placement of women. They've got great stories on there about women at Walmart who were earning a certain salary, and in comes a young 19-year-old guy who was starting at the same level they were, and they were shocked to find out how much more he was making than they were. So this kind of discrimination is still out there, and the standards of perfection don't only have psychological costs, they have real political costs as well. So what should we do? Well, The Mommy Myth was really written as a consciousness-raising book and as a tour through, how did we get here? And it's mouthy, and I think it's really important for us to make fun of these standards of perfection. Humor and laughter and derision are really very powerful. I think we need to get together as women. We can also do this separately, but group activities are much more fun, and really deride these images of perfection and the ridiculous escalation of conspicuous consumption around our children, which has become really immoral, I think. So we also need to look at outcomes. We are told to look at ourselves, oh, what did I fail to do today? What did I didn't do this. How's your kid? How's your kid? Is your kid okay in school? See if she have some friends. See playing a sport he or she likes or an instrument. Is the kid okay? Guess what? You're fine. You're fine. We don't look at it that way. We always think, oh, I didn't, we've got to stop that. We have to throw guilt in the trash. And we have to praise other mothers. The role models for us are not Sarah Jessica Parker. They are not Kate Hudson. They are not Angelina Jolie. They are our sisters. They are our mothers. They are our aunts, our colleagues, our friends. If we look around and see what our friends who are mothers are doing, when I do, I am so impressed about what they're doing and how they're doing it. And some of the women I've met here on this trip have also knocked my socks off and become, for me, incredible role models as well. So this talk and the book is a call to arms with so many smart, hardworking, dedicated, tenacious, fed-up women out there. Can't we all do a better job of talking back to the media that hector us all the time? As we get assaulted by the following headlines: 15 ways to stress-proof your child. Boost your kid's brain power in just 25 minutes. Discipline makeover. Better behavior in 21 days. Right. And what it really takes to make your baby smarter. Not to mention the sex life you always wanted, how to have it now. The answer is put the kids up for adoption. Let's develop some really good comebacks. And let's also take a second look at these mommy wars that we're all supposed to be involved with. The war against welfare mothers, the war between working versus stay-at-home mothers. You know, these wars sell magazines and they sell TV shows. And Dr. Phil, who should know better, has several times now put the stay-at-home moms on one side and the working mothers on the other side. Notice the difference, which one is user-friendly. Okay, so always stay-at-home moms and working mothers. And then they're supposed to get into like a maternal mud wrestling fight. These various magazines from New York Magazine and others, the mommy wars. Now, are there sometimes tensions between stay-at-home mothers and working mothers? Sure there are. But do we all like help each other, schlep each other's kids around, host birthday parties for each other's kids, have sleepovers, go to their sporting events together? Of course we do. I've been a working mother my whole life. The women I deal with who are mothers, some of them don't work at all. Some work part-time. Some work overtime. You know, we all take care of and look out for each other's kids. But this war that the media keep harping on suggests that there is a war and that we have to take sides. Now, what most women do is they make a mosaic of their lives. There are not two mutually exclusive camps, with the working mothers who've always and ever and forever only been working mothers over here, and the stay-at-home mothers who's always and forever and only been stay-at-home mothers over here. Sometimes women stay at home, then they go back to work, they go back home, whatever. We do not constitute two camps. The media exaggerate and magnify these wars to sell magazines and television shows. We should just say no to them. Now, while these wars can benefit one set of mothers over another, what they do stage is all mothers' struggles, whether we stay at home or not. And by the way, you can't win either way, right? If you're a working mother, you can't possibly, you know, bake the cake in the shape of Hogwarts, and you're selfish and you're letting down your kids. But if you're a stay-at-home, you're totally selfish. But if you're a stay-at-home mother, you're boring. And you are expected to do every, mother, homeroom sponsor, bake sale, build fun houses in the backyard, and all of that kind of stuff because you're a stay-at-home mother. Either way, you lose. This is why we must unite together. Because when our struggles are staged as a cat fight, in the face of the most pathetic policies for women and children in the Western world, then the politicians who fail to give us decent daycare or maternity leave or health care can go off and sip sherry while mothers point fingers at each other. Our collective dilemmas as mothers are always translated into individual issues that each of us must confront by herself alone with zero help. So anyhow, the next time you read about Sarah Jessica Parker's perfect marriage and motherhood, don't sigh and say, oh, I wish that was my life. Instead say, give me a break. Of course, most of you probably already say that. Because, if we all refuse to be whipsawed between these age-old Madonna whore poles of perfect and failed motherhood that are designed to police us all, then we, all of us, get a break. Motherhood remains the unfinished business of the women's movement, and the mothers of America and our kids deserve much better than this. Thanks. I'm told we have about 10 minutes for questions. and I'm happy to take questions or comments. I think people can, if you just want to stand, if you want to go to the mic, that's fine, but if you want to stand up, I can repeat the question. Yeah.
It's kind of a long comment, but I'm glad you brought the Today Show. I have two small children, and I want glad to admit it that you also watched a lot of episodes of the Today Show. But those talk shows, and Rachel Ray, I also watched that, and The View, I think that they're a big part of the problem, and I've seen many episodes of these programs where the topic is we're going to find ways or give you tips if you're a stay-at-home mom but you need to earn some money or you want to go back into the working world. And they just did one the other day on Rachel Ray just a couple days ago. And so the tease was, oh, we're going to give you tips about how to earn money if you're a stay-at-home mom. So I'm thinking, great, I wonder what this will be, you know. And I'm thinking of a woman who maybe quit her job because the daycare costs more than her salary and
Right.
they're scraping by, and there are going to be these useful tips for her to figure out how to earn some money and still be able to take care of her children and so on. Well, they featured this woman who had, in trying to think of a gift to give her child's teacher, filled a bag with some corn that her husband had used to feed deer and put it in the microwave and found that you could kind of put it on your shoulders. And then she parlayed this into a $10 million company. She's now worth $10 million because of this bag of corn that you can microwave. And I was thinking how disappointed I would have been if I were that mom who was really looking for the tips, right? Because I wouldn't have felt that but underlying that, you know, is this whole idea that in all these shows, the solutions are always for individual women
Right.
to work within the system, and the system itself that has closed them out of the jobs, that has made them choose between working outside of the home and taking care of the children, that has made it just impossible for women to just, you know, even live up to these crazy standards that you've identified. The system is never, ever questioned on any of these
Right.
things.
Right.
And so I would just come away from it feeling worse than I did, you know. I mean, I'm fortunate because I don't have that exact situation, but I just wonder if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a terrific comment. Did everybody hear the comment? Yeah, okay. It was a great comment, and I agree with you, and I actually think some of these shows have gotten worse. When Where the Girls Are came out, which was my second book, it came out in '94, and I got on the Today Show with the book. And at that time, the Today Show was actually giving time to a lot of mid-list authors. You know, and I was a mid-list author. I'm not Danielle Steele, right? And Mary Pfeiffer had been on the week before me. Hope Edelman, whose book is back there, was on, I think, the week after me. We were all new mid-list authors. Nobody had heard of Mary Pfeiffer before. And they were giving voice to women's concerns. And Mary Pfeiffer's book, which was on the bestseller list for 186 weeks or something, you know, had very concrete case studies about teenage girls that were really hugely helpful to women. Now they've got makeover shows and, you know, fake, you know, there was this period when The Apprentice was hot. They were doing like these fake apprentice shows, and even Oprah's gotten into all this, like make over your house, make over yourself. Like, enough already with making over the house, you know? My house is never going to look like the Pottery Barn catalog, ever, no matter what I do. And so they've gotten into this very more consumerist, more individualized, more trivialized topics. And I think your point is absolutely on the money about not emphasizing, you know, God forbid, they might emphasize the broader systemic issues that really, that mean that women should not be making over the houses. They should be going online to, you know, momsrising.org and joining the list, because it is the system. It is the system. And, you know, there, I don't know how many of you read this article in the New York Times magazine that came out in October of 2003 by Lisa Belkin. It was called The Opt-Out Generation. It became somewhat infamous. And there was a woman on the cover, white background, and the cover title was, "Why do so many women not make it to the top?" Answer, they choose not to. They choose not to. Okay, so you go inside. Who is Lisa Belkin interviewed? 6 of her former classmates from Princeton, all of whose husbands make 6-figure salaries. They can afford to opt out. But here's what was really interesting about that story, and they got tons of hate mail for this, is that who were the women they profiled? One was a litigator. She gets pregnant. She has the baby. She's working 75 hours a week. She goes to her boss and says, look, I've got a little baby. I can't do this. Can I cut back to 40 hours for a certain period of time? No. You either work 75 hours a week or you're fired. That's a choice? That is not a choice. The other one was a news reporter and part-time anchor. Same thing. She was working like 60 hours a week, had a baby. She said, I need to go back to 40 hours for a certain period of time. Same thing. They would not let her do it. This isn't even flex time. This is like going to a regular work week. So when you read all of these stories, none of the women had opted out. None of them. They had been forced out. And so this notion of choice, and that mothers have choices. What choices? You know, most of us work. Why do we work? If we didn't work, we wouldn't pay the mortgage. Our kids wouldn't eat. You know, we work because we have to. And many of us actually like our jobs and like being with grown-up people sometimes, you know? So this notion of choice that gets bandied about, and these shows traffic in that especially, I think is really pernicious. Sorry, it was a long answer, but it's a great comment. Great comment. Is there another hand? Yes.
I have a question. I have an 18-month-old at home, so I think about these things a lot. And I found that my response to a lot of the things that you raised has been to kind of tune out. I don't read the magazines. I don't watch TV. I don't go to the toy stores. There's not very much.
Those are all really helpful things to not do. Yeah.
I'm wondering why, I mean, by implication, a lot of women do continue to do those things. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, why is it so hard for so many people not to do that? Why is it so hard to tune out?
Well, for a variety of reasons. I mean, look, we live in a media-saturated culture, and I think it's just very difficult to escape the media. Some people, I mean, you know, when my child was really tiny, I was a part-time single mother because my husband was commuting, so he'd leave the house first thing Monday morning, and he wouldn't get back till late Thursday night. So if I wanted a shower, that kid got parked in a playpen in front of Sesame Street. That was the only way I got a shower, let alone made dinner or anything else. And I was perfectly happy to park her in front of Sesame Street. But there are some people who, you know, kind of go overboard with that. But I think even for pretty, like, conscientious people, there are times when your kid is going to be watching television. There are times when you're going to have to go to a toy store. And also some people are isolated, and they look to the parenting magazines and the women's magazines for advice. They're like, oh, my kid is doing X. Is this normal or not normal? They're relatively isolated. They don't know other mothers of small children. And so that can make it difficult to kind of tune out. But also, you know, once your kid starts being surrounded by other kids, and the other kids are like, I have this toy, or, you know, they start going to the kid's house to play, and they see media at their house. Once they start going to school, they're surrounded by not only the stuff that kids want and kids are supposed to have, but they're also surrounded by these kinds of expectations about what good mothers do. Because it just, you know, even if and when we all say no, it gets misted into the culture as a set of standards that even if we reject them, we have this sense that we're going to be judged by them, you know. So I think for some people it's hard for a variety of reasons, but there is a whole subculture of mothers who have just said, no TV, no Toys R Us, you know, and none of these trashy parenting magazines. And I think you're really well off to avoid them as much as possible. Yes?
When did the term working mother start? Because haven't mothers worked since the beginning of time?
You know, that's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. Yes, and some mothers have really worked all the time. African American mothers, working class mothers, farm mothers, You know, it's not like there was ever some option to not work. You start to get this term, I don't know exactly when it started, but you know, you start to get it in like the late 70s, the mid to late 70s, in the aftermath of the women's movement, and when there really was an explosion in the number of working mothers. But your question is great, because one of the things that we wrote about in the book that I have found interesting is that when somebody wanted to talk to my mother back in the 1950s and 1960s, they never referred to her as Susan's mom. She was my mother. Mom was what I called her. Mom was what little kids called her. She was my mother. She was an adult. Now, we're also supposed to refer to moms as moms. So, you know, now somebody says, oh, my kid's name is Ella. Oh, yeah, well, I'll go talk to Ella's mom. Well, why am I her mom? I'm a grown-up. I'm her mother. I'm her mom to her. But it's an infantilizing, user-friendly term that is rarely applied to working moms. You know, so we have that bifurcation of working mother and stay-at-home moms. But it's a great question, but I would say the mid to late 70s. So I think I can take one more, and then, is that right, Leo? And then we should stop. Yeah?
I was wondering if you would be willing to do a mini-analysis of the new nanny shows.
Oh, yeah. Super Nanny and Nanny 911. Yeah. You know, I think you've seen one, you've seen them all. But I think they're really interesting, actually, at this moment, because what those shows are critiquing is the overindulgence of children. And what the kind of new momism and this, I think, encourages is having our children think of themselves as the sun god, you know, and being the center of the universe, you know. We never say no to them. We're supposed to give them whatever they want, buy whatever whatever, right? And so I think these nanny shows are very interesting. Notice that they're British nannies. Right, so it's got to be some source outside of American culture who comes in and says to this family, you're nuts. You're not disciplining your kid. You're not giving him or her timeouts. You're not being the grown-up. And I think there is a great deal of criticism and anxiety in this country about parents not being parents and not setting boundaries and not saying no to their kids. And this show absolutely taps into that. Now, do they try to find the most outrageous examples of, you know, kids who run amok? Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite ones was there was a little boy, and again, you know, these are reality shows, so, which is one of the biggest misnomers ever. So, you know, you have no idea how much is exaggerated, how much is staged. You know, you just don't know how much of it is kind of over the top. But this little boy would only pee outside on his mother's flowers. I mean, how do you even get started in a routine like that? You know, I don't know. So, you know, of course, the super nanny is taken aback by this. So I think they're incredibly interesting surveillance shows that seek to define a new middle about parenting in which some discipline is necessary. You're the grown-up. You have to set limits. And I think a lot of people have been resonating with those shows, and I think they watch them for surveillance purposes too, meaning however bad like my kid is, it's not peeing on my plants, you know. So I think they do offer a kind of reassurance factor, and they allow you as a viewer to feel superior to that family, you know, and thinking about, well, at least I don't do that. So they're interesting, and Wife Swap, I think, has been interesting in similar ways, but in the ones I've seen, and again, you know, I am supposed to be watching television for a living, and it's not easy because there's so much stuff on. But with Wife Swap, what's been interesting about that is often it's the fathers at the end of the show who are criticized for how they're raising their children, and it's the mothers who are held up as being the ones who know how to do it, but the wives are always pitted against each other. So it's a competition over which wife really knows best. So, you know, it's kind of a mixed bag. But I understand I need to stop now, and I'm going to go back and sign books if anyone would like me to, and thank you so much for coming.